On August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb at a test site in the Kazakh steppe. The blast was called First Lightning. The device was an implosion weapon with a solid plutonium core. It worked on the first attempt. And the shock it sent through Washington was not just the shock of a geopolitical rival achieving nuclear capability. It was the shock of timing. American physicists had calculated, using everything they knew about Soviet scientific capacity and industrial resources, that the Soviet Union was at minimum 4 years away from a working nuclear weapon. Some estimates put it closer to a decade. They were wrong by years. And for a long time, nobody in American intelligence could fully explain why. The bomb worked because someone had told them how to build it. Not someone sitting in a Moscow laboratory working from theoretical physics. Someone who had been inside the most secret facilities in the American nuclear program. Someone who had walked through the security gates every morning with a valid military ID, done his work, eaten lunch with his colleagues, maybe played a few innings of softball on the company team after his shift, and then handed the Soviet Union the exact chemical blueprint for the component that made their first atomic bomb function. His name was George Koval. His code name was Delmar. He was born in Sioux City, Iowa, on Christmas Day, 1913. He was a graduate of an American high school and an American university. He spoke English without an accent because English was his first language. He was, to every person who ever worked alongside him at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, or Dayton, Ohio, simply a colleague, a smart one, a likable one, a man who knew his chemistry and did his job and gave no one any reason to look at him twice. He was also the only Soviet military intelligence officer ever to successfully penetrate the inner sanctum of the Manhattan Project, the program that cost the United States $2 billion, the most security-conscious scientific undertaking in human history, the project that built the atomic bomb. He walked through it for years. He took what he needed. And then he left. He was never arrested. Never charged, never convicted, never even publicly identified as a spy until the Russian government told the world who he was in 2007, a year after he died, at the age of 92, in a modest apartment in Moscow. This is the complete story of George Koval. And it begins not with espionage, but with a family from Iowa trying to survive the Great Depression. George Abramovich Koval was the son of Abram and Ethel Koval, Jewish immigrants who had come to America from Belarus, then part of the Russian Empire, in the early years of the 20th century. They settled in Sioux City, Iowa, which had a small but established Jewish immigrant community, and built the kind of modest, hard-working American life that millions of immigrant families were building in the Midwest at that time. George grew up speaking English, attending American schools, absorbing American culture with a complete, unself-conscious immersion of a child who has never known anything else. By the time he reached Central High School in Sioux City, he was in the Honor Society, a bright and well-liked student with no visible reason to be anything other than what he appeared to be. Then the Depression hit. And in 1932, when George was 18 years old, the Koval family made a decision that would determine the trajectory of the rest of his life. They moved to the Soviet Union. This was not as unusual as it sounds in 1932. The Depression had devastated the American economy, and the Soviet Union was, at that moment, conducting an aggressive international recruitment campaign aimed specifically at Jewish immigrants and their families, inviting them to settle in a new region called Birobidzhan, designated as a Jewish autonomous oblast in the Soviet Far East near the Chinese border. It was presented as a homeland, a place where Jewish families could build a community free from the anti-Semitism that had driven their families out of Europe in the first place. Thousands of American Jewish families made the same decision the Kovals did. They packed their belongings and went east. The Kovals settled in Birobidzhan. George, now in his late teens and early 20s, eventually moved to Moscow to pursue his education. He enrolled at the D.I. Mendeleev Institute of Chemical Technology, one of the most prestigious technical institutions in the Soviet Union. He was an exceptional student. He graduated with honors in 1939. He was accepted into the graduate program. His future as a Soviet chemist appeared set. But the GRU had been watching him. The GRU was Soviet Military Intelligence, the organization that ran foreign intelligence operations for the Red Army as distinct from the civilian intelligence apparatus. They had identified in George Koval something extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily valuable. A man who was technically a Soviet citizen, trained in chemistry at an elite level, but who had been born in the United States, who spoke English without an accent, who understood American culture from the inside, who could move through American society without the tells and the stiffness and the linguistic imprecision that betrayed most foreign intelligence operatives the moment they opened their mouths. They recruited him in 1939. They declined to send him to graduate school. Instead, they gave him training of a different kind. The operational tradecraft of a professional intelligence officer. How to make contact with a handler. How to pass information securely. How to maintain a cover identity under sustained scrutiny. How to be, in the formal language of intelligence work, an agent operating without diplomatic cover, entirely on their own in a foreign country, with no official connection to the Soviet government that could protect them if they were caught. In 1940, George Koval returned to the United States. He arrived with a carefully constructed legend. He was an American who had gone to the Soviet Union with his family during the Depression and was now returning home. This was not a fabrication. It was the truth, which is the best possible legend. Everything about his background was exactly what it appeared to be, which meant that any investigation into his past would confirm rather than contradict his cover. He spoke American English because he was American. He knew Sioux City because he had grown up there. He knew the Midwest because he had lived there. There was nothing to find because there was nothing hidden. He settled in New York. He enrolled at the City College of New York to complete his American education. He was sociable, academically strong, and well-liked by his classmates. He dated. He went to parties. He helped underclassmen navigate the social rules of dormitory life. A classmate who was later interviewed by the Smithsonian Magazine remembered Koval as famous among the students for knowing how to evade the dormitory bed checks. He was, to everyone who knew him at CCNY, simply a bright and likable guy. Nobody knew he had a wife in Moscow. In April 1943, the United States Army drafted George Koval. This was standard procedure for men of his age and status. He reported as required. He was processed through the standard intake procedures. And at some point during that processing, a decision was made that the GRU would later describe as the most fortunate moment in the entire history of their atomic intelligence program. The Army identified Koval as a candidate for a special technical training program being run at the City College of New York. The program was designed to train Army personnel in the maintenance and operation of equipment used for monitoring radioactive materials. It was, in other words, the gateway program for the atomic project. Students who completed it successfully were being assigned to classified installations across the country. He was accepted. He completed the program. And in late 1944, Private George Koval of the United States Army was assigned to the Manhattan Project's installation at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Let that settle for a moment. The Manhattan Project was the most security-conscious undertaking in American history. Its very existence was classified. The scientists working on it operated under strict compartmentalization, meaning each person knew only what they needed to know for their specific role and nothing else. The security infrastructure around it involved the FBI, Army counterintelligence, and layers of physical and procedural controls designed to prevent exactly what George Koval was about to do. The entire apparatus of American wartime security had been built and deployed specifically to stop Soviet infiltration. And George Koval walked straight through it. Because he was in the United States Army. Because his background check confirmed everything he said about himself. Because the GRU had constructed his cover not from lies but from truth. And because the Army assigned him directly to Oak Ridge based on his legitimate technical qualifications. At Oak Ridge, Koval was assigned as a health physics officer. This role required him to monitor radiation levels across the installation, which meant he had authorized access to a wider range of facilities and a broader overview of what was happening in each of them than almost any other individual at his level. His colleagues were Nobel Prize winners and the most brilliant physicists and chemists in the world. George Koval checked their radiation exposure and kept their equipment calibrated and moved through their laboratories every day without anyone thinking twice about why he was there. He was later transferred to the Dayton Project in Ohio, a facility focused on a specific and extraordinarily sensitive component of the atomic bomb. The component was the initiator. The initiator is the device at the heart of an implosion atomic weapon that triggers the nuclear chain reaction at the precise microsecond it needs to occur. Without a functioning initiator, the bomb does not work. The initiator being developed at the Dayton facility used a combination of polonium and beryllium. The chemistry involved in producing polonium of the required purity in the required quantities on the required schedule was among the most technically demanding processes in the entire Manhattan Project. It was also among the most secret. George Koval handled this material every day. Between 1945 and early 1946, he met regularly with his Soviet handler, a contact operating under the codename Clyde, to pass along what he had learned. The meetings were conducted using the standard tradecraft of the era. Casual encounters in public places. Brief exchanges of materials. No written records that could be traced. Koval passed his intelligence verbally and through hand-drawn notes and diagrams that he had memorized and reconstructed after leaving the facility. On February 13, 1946, the GRU received a report from Koval that included a detailed description of the manufacturing process for polonium. It included the specific quantities involved, the methods used, the equipment required, and the quality standards that the Dayton facility had developed through months of expensive trial and error. It was not theoretical knowledge. It was operational knowledge. The kind that could be handed to a Soviet laboratory and used immediately. This report, and the others that preceded and followed it, did not just give the Soviet atomic program useful information. They gave it the specific recipe for the initiator used in the first Soviet atomic bomb. When Russian military officials disclosed in 2007 the crucial factor in their accelerated achievement, they stated that the initiator for the first lightning bomb had been prepared to the recipe provided by military intelligence agent Delmar. That recipe belonged to George Koval. In 1946, Koval was honorably discharged from the United States Army. He returned to New York and completed his bachelor's degree in electrical engineering at City College, graduating cum laude in February 1948. He attended his graduation ceremony. He accepted his diploma. He shook hands with his professors. Later that year, he booked passage on a ship to Europe. He never came back. The moment the FBI realized something had gone wrong at Oak Ridge and Dayton did not come until after Koval had already left. The investigation that followed, the piecing together of who had been in which facility with what access at what time, was the kind of retrospective counterintelligence work that is always slower and always harder than the operational work that preceded it. By the time investigators had assembled enough of the picture to understand that a significant breach had occurred, the man at the center of it had been living in Moscow for years. The FBI opened a file. They investigated. They interviewed his former colleagues at Oak Ridge and Dayton and CCNY. Almost none of them had any information that was useful. They remembered him as a good colleague, friendly, competent, normal. None of them had seen anything that alarmed them at the time, because there had been nothing visible to see. Koval had not been careless. He had not been indiscreet. He had not attracted attention or raised suspicions or made a single identifiable mistake in years of operation inside the most sensitive facilities in America. The FBI file ran to nearly 2,000 pages. It produced no arrest, no indictment, no publicly identified suspect. George Koval's name does not appear in the official public record of Manhattan Project espionage cases the way that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg appear, or the way Klaus Fuchs appears. He was not tried. He was not convicted. He was not executed. He was simply gone, living quietly in Moscow under his own name, working as an associate professor at the Mendeleev Institute where he had studied before the war, teaching chemistry to students who had no idea who he was. His colleagues at the institute liked him. He was known as a modest, intellectually rigorous man who stayed late to help his students and who lived simply on a professor's salary. He did not talk about his past. He did not draw attention to himself. When he eventually retired, his colleagues reportedly refused to let him stop working entirely because they valued him too much. He remained connected to the Institute well into his 70s. He died on January 31, 2006, at the age of 92. He was buried in Moscow. At the time of his death, very few people outside a small circle of Russian military intelligence historians knew his name. And then, on November 2, 2007, Vladimir Putin stood before a gathering at the GRU Museum in Moscow and said his name out loud. Putin signed a presidential decree posthumously awarding George Koval, the hero of the Russian Federation, the nation's highest honor, for his courage and heroism while carrying out special missions. He acknowledged publicly and explicitly that Koval's work had helped speed up considerably the time it took for the Soviet Union to develop an atomic bomb. He named him as the agent codenamed Delmar. And in doing so, he confirmed, officially and irreversibly, what a small number of historians had begun to piece together from fragmentary evidence over the preceding decade. The revelation landed in the United States with a particular kind of impact. Not the sharp shock of a breaking news story, but the slower, more disorienting feeling that comes when something you thought you understood about history turns out to have had a dimension you completely missed. The Rosenbergs were the story that Americans knew about Manhattan Project espionage. Julius and Ethel, convicted in 1951, executed in 1953, their case debated and protested and argued about for decades. Klaus Fuchs, the British physicist who passed atomic secrets to the Soviets from Los Alamos, was the other name most people knew. George Koval was neither of those things. He was not caught. He was not tried. He was not part of any public debate about espionage and justice and the ethics of the nuclear age. He was a ghost, a man who had moved through the most secret program in American history, taken what his country needed, and disappeared so completely that the United States government spent 60 years not knowing exactly what he had done or how much of it had gotten through. The comparison between Koval and the other known atomic spies is instructive in ways that go beyond the simple question of who got caught. Klaus Fuchs was a scientist who had ideological motivations. He believed that a world in which only one country possessed nuclear weapons was more dangerous than a world in which two powers balanced each other. His espionage was, in his own framing, an act of conscience. He was caught in 1950, confessed, served 9 years in a British prison, and was released. The Rosenbergs were convicted on the basis of testimony and documentary evidence. Julius Rosenberg had operated a network of sources. He was a recruiter and a handler, not a scientist with direct access to technical secrets. He and Ethel were executed in June 1953. Koval was different from both of them in a way that the American intelligence community found almost impossible to fully accept once they understood it. He was not an ideological sympathizer who had made a personal decision to share secrets. He was not a recruiter working through a network of motivated civilians. He was a trained professional intelligence officer, a commissioned agent of Soviet military intelligence who had been sent into the field with a specific mission and had executed that mission with a precision and a completeness that his handlers in Moscow described as exceptional. He was, in the formal language of Cold War intelligence, the real thing. A sleeper. A penetration agent. A man whose entire existence in America had been shaped from the beginning toward a single operational purpose, who had spent years building the cover that allowed him to stand in a classified laboratory with a radiation monitor in his hand and complete access to everything he needed to know. The historian John Earl Haynes, a Cold War specialist at the Library of Congress who spent years studying the FBI's Koval files, described him in terms that capture the specific quality of what he was. He said Koval was a meticulously trained operative, not merely a private citizen from America. He exemplified a seldom-seen phenomenon, often depicted in novels but seldom encountered in reality. A deeply embedded, professional intelligence officer. The question of how much time Koval's intelligence actually saved the Soviet atomic program is one that historians continue to debate. The most commonly cited estimate is that his intelligence, combined with that of Klaus Fuchs at Los Alamos, shortened the Soviet timeline by somewhere between 1 and 4 years. Given that the Soviet bomb detonated in 1949 when American experts had predicted 1953 at the earliest, that range is consistent with what was observed. Russian military officials have been more specific, stating that the initiator for the first lightning bomb was built directly to Koval specifications. What that means in terms of historical consequence is not a simple calculation. The Soviet bomb changed the strategic balance of the Cold War. It led to the nuclear arms race. It produced the doctrine of mutually assured destruction that governed superpower relations for 4 decades and arguably prevented a Third World War by making the cost of direct conflict between the superpowers unacceptable to both sides. Whether a world in which the Soviet Union had achieved nuclear capability 4 years later would have been more or less stable is a question that cannot be answered. History does not run the experiment. What can be said is that George Koval was at the center of it. A man born in Iowa on Christmas Day, who grew up playing in the Midwest and graduated from an American high school and spent the most secret years of his life in classified facilities in Tennessee and Ohio, and then went home to Moscow and taught chemistry for 50 years and died at 92, and collected his Hero of the Russian Federation medal through a representative because he was no longer alive to receive it in person. He played the long game longer than almost anyone in the history of intelligence work. He played it perfectly. He was never arrested. He was never charged. He never stood in a courtroom. He never appeared in an American newspaper under his own name as anything other than a man who once worked at Oak Ridge. The $2 billion that the United States spent building the atomic bomb bought them a weapon that changed the world. They also bought George Koval 4 years of access to everything he needed to hand the same capability to the other side. He never spent a day in jail for it. He spent his last day on Earth the same way he spent most of them. A modest professor in Moscow. Unremarkable. Unassuming. Invisible in exactly the way he had always been best at being invisible. The way he had learned to be invisible in Iowa and in New York and in the secret laboratories of the most dangerous weapons program in human history. The most successful spy of the atomic age. Hidden in plain sight from the first day to the last. Leave a comment below. Tell me what part of this story you cannot stop thinking about. Tell me whether you think the world is more or less stable because of what George Koval did. This is one of those stories where the historical consequences are still unfolding. Because every nuclear weapon that exists today, every strategic calculation made by every nuclear power, sits inside a framework that was partly shaped by a man from Sioux City who played shortstop and kept his secrets until the day he died. Subscribe right now so you never miss the next story. Because history is full of men like George Koval, and most of them have not been found yet.